The Victorian era, which spanned from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, was a period of significant social, economic, and cultural development. However, it also had a dark side, with harsh punishments. People thought that being extremely harsh would scare others into obeying and teach them good principles. The punishments, however, were frequently cruel and inhumane by today's standards. The Industrial Revolution shook things up, as towns expanded rapidly and became overcrowded. Poverty was widespread, and criminality increased dramatically. To keep things under control, officials imposed tough laws and punishments. They believed in eye for an eye justice, which required that the punishment be proportionate to the crime. Unfortunately, this approach frequently resulted in poor and vulnerable individuals getting the worst of it. Punishments were not just intended to teach those who disobeyed the rules a lesson. They were also putting on a show for everyone else. Executions, public beatings, and prison sentences were all carried out in front of large audiences to ensure that everyone knew who was in control and what would happen if they stepped out of line. It was a bad moment to be on the wrong side of the law. Capital punishment, public executions. Public executions remained a staple of Victorian jurisprudence until they were abolished in 1868. These incidents were intended to demonstrate the final consequences of criminal behavior and serve as a deterrent. Hanging was the most popular mode of execution, with offences ranging from murder to thievery. However, the spectacle of public executions frequently transformed these sombre events into public entertainments rather than sober warnings. Newgate Prison in London was one of the most infamous execution locations, with thousands gathering to see condemned criminals' dying moments. The atmosphere during these ceremonies was both carnival-like and morbid, with food sellers and hawkers hawking execution ballads and papers outlining the crimes of the killed. The condemned were frequently paraded through the streets in a solemn procession, with the opportunity for a final drink or last words before being executed. One of the most prominent incidents was the hanging of William Palmer, a doctor accused of poisoning his patients in 1856. An estimated 30,000 people gathered outside Stafford Prison to see his execution. The event was so popular that special trains were organised to convey attendees. After ascending the scaffold, Palmer reportedly asked the executioner, "Are you sure it's safe?" A comment that only increased popular curiosity and sick obsession with his fate. Another well-known execution was that of the Mannings, a married couple accused of murdering their associate Patrick O'Connor in 1849. Their public execution at Horsemonger Lane Jail attracted a large crowd, including Charles Dickens, who later opposed the procedure. He claimed that public executions degraded and brutalized viewers rather than preventing crime. Dickens eloquently portrayed the drunkenness, clamour, and confusion in the throng in his letters, saying that such spectacles simply fostered the public's desire for violence. In 1864, crowds attended the execution of Franz Müller, a German tailor convicted of the first railway murder in Britain. His crime, murdering Thomas Briggs for his gold watch, stunned Victorian society. Müller was apprehended following a high-speed police chase across the Atlantic and was eventually executed in public. His case highlighted the growing importance of forensic investigation and international law enforcement in criminal justice. By the mid-19th century, mounting worries about crowd behaviour and the questionable moral repercussions of public executions had sparked arguments over their effectiveness. Critics, including reformers and writers such as Dickens, claimed that public executions did not discourage crime, but rather hardened society to brutality. The 1868 Capital Punishment Amendment Act officially halted public executions in Britain, relocating them within prison walls, where they remained a brutal but private occurrence. Although the sight of public executions was banned, the cruelty of capital punishment continued well into the 20th century. The change to private executions reflected shifting attitudes toward justice, which prioritized reform and deterrence over public spectacle. However, the obsession with executions persisted, with newspapers continuing to write on the dying moments of condemned criminals, ensuring that the grisly legacy of public hangings lived on in the public memory. Transportation, a life of transportation and exile. Transportation was another harsh penalty in the Victorian era. Criminals, frequently guilty of petty theft or other non-violent offences, were deported to penal colonies in Australia. Transportation, which was first implemented in the late 18th century, served as both a punishment and a solution to Britain's overcrowded jails. The voyage itself was frightening. Convicts spent months on ships in overcrowded, unclean circumstances, where sickness and hunger were frequent. Deaths during transportation were common, and survivors were frequently frail and ill. Convicts in Australia faced a harsh new reality. They were put to arduous tasks like as clearing land, constructing roads, and erecting villages in the blazing sun. Many worked in chain gangs, where they faced severe discipline and harsh punishments for any perceived insubordination. Isolation was another important feature of transportation. Convicts were isolated from their family, with little or no chance of reunion. Letters and communication were extremely infrequent, and many people never saw their loved ones again. The psychological toll of exile was enormous, as many grappled with alienation, loneliness, and the humiliation associated with their prisoner status. The story of Mary Bryant, a convict transferred to Australia in 1788, exemplifies the difficulties of transportation. Bryant and her family were detained at Botany Bay after being convicted of larceny. Despite the hard conditions, she was able to escape in a small boat with her family and a few others, rowing thousands of kilometres to safety, demonstrating the desperation and resilience of transported convicts. While transportation was frequently viewed as a less severe option to execution, it essentially sentenced victims to a life of pain. The punishment lasted until 1868, when it was officially discontinued. By then, almost 162,000 men, women and children had been transported to Australia, leaving an indelible mark on both British and Australian histories. The penal colonies eventually became successful settlements, but the stories of the inmates and their struggles continue to demonstrate the harshness of Victorian justice. Imprisonment, the rise of the silent system. Victorian prisons were designed to break the spirit of inmates through extreme discipline and isolation. The silent system, implemented in many prisons, required inmates to remain silent at all times. Communication, even through gestures, was strictly forbidden. This practice aimed to encourage reflection and repentance, but often led to severe psychological distress. Prisoners were subjected to monotonous and physically demanding tasks, such as the crank and the tread wheel. The crank involved turning a handle thousands of times a day, while the tread wheel required prisoners to walk continuously on a rotating cylinder, often with little purpose other than punishment. These tasks were grueling, purposeless, and designed to instill obedience through suffering. Conditions in Victorian prisons were abysmal. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition were rampant. Diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis spread rapidly, and many prisoners died from neglect or abuse. The case of Pentonville Prison in London exemplifies the harshness of the silent system. Opened in 1842, it subjected inmates to solitary confinement and absolute silence, often leading to mental breakdowns and suicides. Victorian jails were designed to crush convict spirits through strict discipline and isolation. Execution by garrote, a rare but horrific punishment. While hanging was the most common mode of execution, the garrote was sometimes used for extremely terrible crimes. This method involves strangling the condemned with a tightly wound string or metal collar. Although less frequent in Britain, it was used in several of its colonies and was notorious for its agonizing and lengthy death. The garrote became infamous in Spain and her colonies, where it was the predominant form of death for centuries. One prominent occurrence was the execution of Mariana de Pineda, a Spanish liberal who was sentenced to death by garrote for her political activity against Ferdinand VII's absolutist reign. Her death generated anger, making her a martyr for the liberal cause. In the Philippines, during Spanish colonial control, the garrote was used to kill national hero José Rizal in 1896. Rizal's execution in a public area in Manila represented the harsh nature of Spanish rule and sparked the Philippine Revolution against colonial rulers. The garrote was also occasionally used in British-controlled regions for high-profile cases. During the British Raj in India, it was occasionally used against rebels or criminals who were regarded particularly dangerous. The method's link with extended agony made it a feared and despised type of punishment. The usage of the garrote represented the era's emphasis on punishment as both retribution and deterrent. Although it has since been disbanded, its history serves as a sobering reminder of the terrible methods used in the name of justice. Branding and maiming, marks of shame. As a measure of public humiliation, criminals were permanently marked by branding and maiming practices. Branding entailed burning a mark, such as the letter T for thief, into the skin. This punishment was not only physically unpleasant, but also socially stigmatizing, as it labeled people as criminals for life. Notable examples of branding include highwaymen in 17th and 18th century Britain, who were frequently marked before being executed or transported. Maiming, albeit less widespread, featured the amputation of body parts as punishment for certain transgressions. In medieval England, criminals may have their hands severed, whilst poachers feared disfigurement. Though these practices declined throughout the course of the Victorian era, their legacy highlighted the severe nature of justice at the time. The well-known instance of Jonathan Wild, an infamous 18th century criminal who died in public but whose associates had branding marks, exemplifies this terrible era. In Britain's colonies, punishment might be significantly worse. Indigenous communities and rebellious subjects were frequently subjected to harsh methods in order to preserve colonial power. Floggings, executions, and other types of torture were employed to quell rebellion and impose British rule. These punishments were severe, reflecting the era's racial and cultural prejudices. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 is a harsh illustration of colonial retribution. Following the revolution, captured rebels were frequently executed by being strapped to the mouths of cannons and blown apart in order to frighten and control local populations. Similarly, during the 1798 Irish uprising, public floggings and executions were employed to put down resistance and establish imperial authority. These terrible deeds became symbols of resistance among oppressed peoples, fueling anti-colonial movements. Reform and the decline of brutality. By the late Victorian era, reform movements had begun to question the harshness of the criminal system. Activists such as Elizabeth Fry and John Howard fought for more humane jail conditions and the prohibition of public executions. Their initiatives helped to gradually reduce the use of harsh punishments and promote more rehabilitative approaches to justice. The Prisons Act of 1865, for example, aimed to standardize jail conditions while reducing the use of corporal punishment. This regulation required regular inspections and improved hygienic conditions in order to change the focus from retribution to rehabilitation. The termination of transportation in 1868, as well as the public executions that year, signified significant advances in the prison system. Organizations such as the Howard League for Penal Reform continued to advocate for change into the 20th century, leaving a legacy of compassion and justice in stark contrast to the violence of previous centuries.